Well, hello there. Today we are starting part 1 of our diorama. Now I'm going to do a 3-part course on this little diorama. The first part 1 we are going to paint the tree and the leaves and the little mushrooms. In part 2 we shall paint the Nazgul, and then in part 3 we will paint the Hobbits hiding under the tree. As you can see, I've already given the whole miniature a black undercoat. Now to get this prepped up, all you need to do is wash your resin in soapy water, and of course then you just prep the miniature and paint it with your black primers. You can either use a spray paint or a black primer, and of course it all comes apart here at the back, and you can paint this separately. So we've got the ring race there, looking absolutely fantastic, built up. Absolutely beautiful, beautiful miniature. So we'll have that one to do. That'll be part 2, and this will be part 3. This is the little Hobbits. Now with the Hobbits, what I've done, I've given it a black primer, and the Hobbits I've given a white primer coat. This will really help bring out the colours when we get round to painting the Hobbits, but that'll be in part 3. So there'll just be little 10-minute videos of each one. Now today we are going to make a start on this, the awesome little tree here, and we just need a few colours for this one. We're using wood stained brown, we're using some jungle moss, some rusty red, a bit of dragon white, and some fireball orange. Now I will be going for a traditional red kind of woodland mushrooms. I'm not following the pictures on the Lord of the Rings books or anything. The ferns I will be following green though, so with the ferns we'll be using greens and adding a little bit of white to highlight that. So let's make a start. Okay, so we are starting off with our wood stained brown. I've got this large brush, just taking some excess off there, and what we're going to do is go quite heavily over the whole miniature, including the mushrooms and the ferns, because they're all going to be painted separately. What we're after is just a nice dark wood effect going all around this miniature. Very, very simple to do, and the finished effect will look absolutely beautiful for an old tree. I'll be keeping the black for the actual diorama where there's no miniature, so the contrast will be nice dark black against the dark browns, and then we'll have those greens. The greens will kind of pop out with those red mushrooms, so that'll be very, very nice. So as you can see, it's already picking out all the wood areas on this miniature. Now inside the little cave here, let's just pick this up a little bit. We've got a little bit of detail in there, but it's mainly underground mud. So what we're going to do is just a very light dry brush of brown at the back, because once the miniatures are inside, you're not going to be able to see behind them anyway, because it's going to be very, very dark. So we just add a tiny little highlight on the back there, and then straight back, and we keep spinning around. This little spinny wheel, by the way, this is from my airbrush. I just find it's absolutely fantastic for painting. You can really work on your miniatures well if you're painting with the miniatures on the table. You can just hold it with your little finger there, and fantastic for larger miniatures. You just spin around and paint as you go. Now I'm going to add a little bit of driftwood brown to our wood stained brown. This will just darken it a little bit more. Just give it a little highlight, make it a little bit lighter. And as you can see, it's starting to already look fab. I do love painting nature. I love painting plants. I love painting rocks. I love painting trees. They are my favourite things to paint. A lot of people have said to me, my goodness, you like painting boring things. Honestly, painting trees and flowers, plants, it's beautiful. Nature is a beautiful thing. So painting all these things to me is just fantastic. Gives me so much joy painting and making it look as close as possible to a tree. If I can make a rock look like a rock and a tree look like a tree, I know I'm doing okay. Okay, for the final little highlight, we've got some creamy ivory. This is quite a light colour, and we're just going to add a tiny little touch and mix that in for our final highlight. Now we're going to be very delicate with this one. This is the last highlight for the wood, so it's just a hint of light, just to pick out some details around the parts of the twigs and the branches there. Now all I've done is used a large brush for the whole of this miniature. So far it's very simple. We'll be using a standard brush in a minute to do the actual mushrooms and the ferns, but as you can see, very simple little effects. We're just using two browns and the creamy ivory, and it's already looking absolutely fantastic. This, I don't think I'm not even going to need an ink wash with this one. I think this looks absolutely fab. So simple to do, but the effect is looking very nice. This is the colours I needed. Okay, so what I'm going to do now, I'm going to leave this dry for a few minutes, and then we'll move on to the mushrooms, and then we'll do the ferns. Okay, let's move on to the mushrooms. And for the mushrooms, we are using Rusty Red as our base coat, and our Fireball Orange as a little highlight to the mushrooms. Now I'm using a size 0 brush. This is a pro brush by Reaper Miniatures. So very simple. We paint our mushroom first, or toadstool, but we paint our little mushroom red. I've zoomed in a little bit closer so you can see a little bit better. What we're doing is each little mushroom, we're just painting in red. Simple as that. But what we want to do is, while the paint is still wet, we want to add that orange highlight, because that will blend in to our little toadstool or mushroom. We'll call them mushrooms. So what I'm doing now, I'm not washing the brush, I'm going straight to the orange, and just dabbing a tiny bit of orange to the tops of each one of these mushrooms, like so. Just adding a little bit of colour variation, and what will happen is when that dries, it'll look absolutely beautiful. And that's it. That's all you need to do. So all we need to do now is we'll zoom around and paint the rest of these mushrooms just to show you. It's an absolutely beautiful diorama. All these little mushrooms and the ferns. Growing up in the 80s, painting miniatures. And it's all Games Workshop miniatures back then in the 80s for me. Warhammer. Every single base I used to paint. I used to make milliput. I don't know if you remember the milliput. It was a two-part mix epoxy resin, and we'd all be making milliput and mushrooms back in the 80s, and using a little bit of wire and making a little mushroom top. And then nearly every single base from a fantasy painter back in the 80s would have these mushrooms stuck everywhere, where we'd made all these milliput mushrooms and used them for our bases. I mean, we still use them now. We still use them now, but we don't use the milliput as much. But any of you old school painters who follow my channel, you know exactly what I'm talking about. But it was all the rage, and I absolutely loved adding all these little mushrooms to my bases. Let me get this focus. That focus doesn't look too good there. Not the best of cameras, I know, and I apologise. My channel is not the most expensive. My channel definitely is not the most expensive. I haven't got the most expensive things, but I think it's okay for what I'm doing. I'm never going to be a super high-powered channel, that's for sure. But as long as you guys are having fun and I'm having fun, who cares, eh? So what I'm painting about 6 or 7 mushrooms, and that gives me time to go back and then add that little bit of orange to the tops. And again, we just go back. It's just a tiny hint of orange. It might not seem like anything, but it makes such a difference. It's almost like a little light source coming off the top of the mushrooms. And as you can see, because we've got that nice orange, red and orange, they really pop on the actual diorama. On the diorama painted by the official Games Workshop team, they've painted the mushrooms in a very dark mushroom, which is good. There's nothing wrong with that at all. Look, I'll show you. They've painted it with the dark browns, the mushrooms. But the contrast now with me painting the red mushrooms, I just think it adds, it's just a little bit more colour, which I think looks really nice, added to the wood. I remember back in the 70s, I living on the farm in the 70s, and we had a wood behind the farm. I was such a lucky boy growing up on a farm. Anyway, we used to walk the sheepdogs through the woods, and they had always saw these red fantasy mushrooms, as you call it. There's always red mushrooms. We sometimes had puffballs, but we always had these mushrooms. It was red ones. So this is why I've got a thing about red mushrooms, is because that's what I remember seeing as a kid back in the 70s. So that's that. It's very, very simple to do. We'll let that dry for 5 minutes. I'm going to grab myself a cup of coffee, and then I'll come back and we shall get those ferns done, and that will be our tree finished. For the ferns, I'm using a dark green. This is jungle moss. So first of all, we're going to cover the ferns with a jungle moss. So let's just go over each one. Let's quickly go over these. What I'll do is I'll just do a couple, because we'll be here for hours otherwise, because there's quite a lot of ferns. So what I'm going to do is just show you a little handful of ferns and how I'm painting them, and then I'll show you the finished ferns. So we'll just do a couple for now. We'll just do these ones as well, and I will come back once the screen is dried and we'll go to the next stage. We'll just speed up the process a little bit, otherwise it will be a very, very long video watching me painting ferns, and really you just after the technique of how I'm going to paint my ferns. So what I'll do is I'll finish off all the greens and then come back, but that's the initial paint using some jungle moss. Okay, so to bring some life into our ferns, what we're going to do is add a bright, vibrant green on top of the dark green. This is Squog Green by MSP Paints, and what I'm going to do, I got the most tiniest, the number 2 dry brush. It's a tiny weeny little dry brush by Reaper Miniatures, and what we're going to do is very simply add some paint to the dry brush, take the paint off, and then go over the ferns. This will give us a lovely contrasting colour, and it will bring out the detail and also make the ferns stand out a little bit more, and that's all we want. Don't even need to add an ink wash to this miniature, which is absolutely fantastic. So we will do a few layers going over with the dry brush. What we're trying to do is pick out all the details on these ferns, and mainly a little bit more towards the tips of the ferns. And again, once more. Yeah, beautiful. They're totally coming alive. Absolutely beautiful. Now, they're not too bright and they're not too dark. But what I'm trying not to do is make everything super bright, because we don't want to take away the emphasis on what the miniature and diorama is about. The diorama is about the 4 hobbits under the tree, and also our Nazgul on the top there. So what we're trying to do is make a beautiful looking diorama with the colours and the tree, etc. But we're not trying to take our eyes away from the initial diorama, which would be, your first look would be the Nazgul and the 4 hobbits. So I think that looks fab. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to finish off the ferns. I'll give you a 360 and we'll call this one finished. This is the finished diorama base for the actual miniatures. This is part 1. So what we got here is our initial, the tree for the diorama is completely finished, and for part 2 we're going to move on and paint the Nazgul. So I hope you enjoyed this little tutorial, or just a little hobby paint, and I shall be doing the Nazgul in a day's time, so only a couple of days, and I'll put up part 2, and the following days I'll put up part 3 and showing you the rest of the diorama. But absolutely fantastic, very simple paint to do. You get the right colours and it looks absolutely fantastic. So very, very happy with that. And what we'll do is next we shall paint our Nazgul. So until next time.